On the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay, inside the Baltimore metropolitan area, a little over 20 miles from downtown, a peninsula pushes out into the water at exactly the point where the Gunpowder and the Bush Rivers meet the bay. It is fenced. It is an active Army base. Most people who live within sight of it, if they think of it at all, as a weapons range, a place where the Army tests tanks and artillery. That peninsula, the Edgewood area of Aberdeen Proving Ground, was the birthplace of the American chemical weapons program. And for roughly a quarter of a century, the Army exposed about 7,000 of its own soldiers there to nerve agents, mustard gas, and mind-altering drugs, including LSD. The ground and the water around it hold decades of buried and dumped munitions, some of it chemical, some of it left exactly where it lies because it was judged too dangerous to move. It is an EPA Superfund site, and it sits on the edge of the estuary that defines this entire region. The Army had an official name for the men in those experiments. It called them volunteers. The program ran from the late 1940s until 1975, when it was shut down amid congressional hearings and accusations of unethical conduct. The men who went through it had signed consent forms. Those forms are the reason this is complicated, and the reason the Army itself, decades later, would no longer defend what was written on them. To understand why this happened here, you have to go back to 1917. Edgewood Arsenal was established that year as a direct response to the German use of poison gas in the trenches of the First World War. Its purpose from day one was chemical, to manufacture, to test, and to defend against poison gas. In that first era, it made chlorine and phosgene. Aberdeen Proving Ground itself, the conventional weapons testing installation next door, was established the same year. The two operated separately until Edgewood was folded into Aberdeen in 1971. For more than a century, Edgewood has been the principal home of American chemical warfare research. The geography was the entire point. The site was a peninsula, remote enough in 1917 to be defensible and to keep the gas away from cities, surrounded on three sides by water with islands and marshes for open-air testing ranges. And that same isolation that made it useful is also the source of the environmental legacy, because for decades the testing, the disposal, and the manufacturing all happened on ground threaded with tidal creeks that drained directly into the Chesapeake. What you left in the water went out of sight. Through both World Wars and the Cold War, Edgewood manufactured and stored chemical agents, including mustard. As late as the modern era, the Army kept a meaningful fraction of the nation's chemical agent stockpile there in steel-ton containers. That stockpile is the one genuinely resolved part of this story, and I will hold it for later. For most of the 20th century, this was one of the most concentrated collections of chemical weapons material in the country, sitting on the edge of a major American estuary, within reach of a major American city. And then there is the disposal culture, which is the pivot. For much of the 20th century, the accepted way to get rid of surplus or unstable munitions was to burn them, bury them, or put them in the water. This was not unique to Edgewood. Sea disposal of chemical weapons was routine U.S. military practice for decades, but Edgewood did it on the edge of the Chesapeake. Munitions were open-burned and open-detonated at places with clipped, bureaucratic names like O Field and J Field. Chemical rounds were disposed of in pits and in the shallows. And between 1922 and 1925, according to Army officials, an unknown quantity of white phosphorus munitions was buried in the tidal flats of the bay itself, within a few miles of housing. Later environmental studies found that elemental phosphorus is extremely toxic to aquatic life, and that dredging or storms could loosen it, raising the threat of explosion when it dries on contact with air. None of this is contested or fringe history. It is documented by the EPA Superfund listing, by the Army's own public health assessments through the ATSDR, by the Maryland Department of the Environment, and by contemporaneous reporting, including a 1986 Washington Post investigation that followed a chemical spill into a bay tributary. The federal regulator, the state, the Army, and the press all describe the same peninsula. But the contamination in the ground and the water, serious as it is not what dragged Edgewood in front of Congress. That was something else. Something that happened not to the marshes, but to the men. And it operated under a single, reassuring word. After the Second World War, American researchers obtained the formulas for the nerve agents German scientists had developed: Taban, sarin, soman, a class of chemicals far deadlier than the mustard of the First World War. The United States needed to understand them, how they injured, how fast, at what dose, and above all, how to protect and treat a soldier who had been exposed. Edgewood, already the center of chemical research, became the place where that understanding was pursued. And the Army decided that the only way to truly know how these agents affected a human being was to give them to human beings. The program was called the Medical Research Volunteer Program. From roughly 1948 to 1975, according to the Army's own disclosures and the National Academy's reviews, about 7,000 soldier volunteers were exposed at Edgewood to some 254 different chemicals. The list, according to the Department of Veterans Affairs, included nerve agents like sarin and VX, mustard and other blister agents, antidotes to nerve agents, and a category the Army called incapacitants, psychochemicals meant not to kill but to disable, including LSD and a powerful deliriant designated BZ. Some studies tested how much antidote a person needed. Some tested whether a drug could render a soldier temporarily unable to function. Some simply tested what a given agent did. And then the human reality, told through the documented record. A pattern recurs across the accounts. Volunteers who were not told what they were being given. Men who agreed to a vague offer of research duty as an alternative to less desirable assignments, and who in some cases only understood afterward what had been done to them. One volunteer, John Ross, described to the New Yorker how he was injected with a nerve agent and, as the needle went in, overheard the doctors say the substance was lethal. He went into convulsions. He survived, but suffered years of depression and insomnia afterward. And there is the documented case of Harold Blower, who died in 1953 after being injected with an Army-supplied chemical in a related program in New York. The proof that the risks were not hypothetical. The ethics of this I am not going to resolve for you, because they do not resolve. Weigh both sides. On one hand, the Army's stated aim was defensive, to protect soldiers against chemical warfare, in a Cold War when the Soviet program was real and advancing. The volunteers did sign consent forms. Some participated only in equipment or performance tests with no agent at all, and the program produced real chemical defense knowledge. On the other hand, stated plainly, the Army itself does not today defend the adequacy of those consent forms. Long-term health follow-up was not built into the studies, so the men were, in effect, never tracked. The Nuremberg Code, which established informed consent as the precondition for human research, had been published in 1947, before most of this took place. And the word volunteer was carrying an enormous amount of weight for men inside a military hierarchy, being offered an attractive alternative to regular duty. A reasonable person can accept that the defensive goal was real and still find the arrangement indefensible by the standard the country had already written down. What finally brought this to light was not a scientific discovery, but a disclosure. In 1975, congressional hearings and an Army Inspector General investigation forced the program into the open and shut it down. In the 1980s, the National Academies conducted long-term reviews of the health effects. Beginning in 2003, the Department of Defense formally set out to notify surviving participants of what they had been exposed to decades after the fact. And in 2009, a group of veterans sued the Army, the Department of Defense, and the CIA. In 2013, a federal judge ruled that the Army had an ongoing duty to notify test subjects of health information, but the litigation did not deliver the broad finding of harm or the compensation that many veterans had sought. As with the other sites in this series, the exposure is proven, the inadequate consent is effectively conceded, and the individual long-term causation was never cleanly established in either direction. And you can verify all of this yourself, because that is the strange thing about Edgewood. The evidence was not leaked. It was published by the people who did it. Search 2 words, Edgewood Volunteers. What comes back is not a conspiracy site. It is the Army's own disclosure, listing the time frame, the roughly 7,000 participants, and the categories of chemicals in dry, official language. It is the health effects reports of the National Academies from the 1980s. It is the public court record of the 2013 ruling. The proof that thousands of American soldiers were dosed with nerve agents and LSD inside the Baltimore metro is posted by the institution that did it. The word volunteer was meant to make it sound settled and consensual, and the most powerful thing you can do is follow that exact word into the official record and read what it actually covers. And while you are there, the EPA Superfund profile for the Edgewood area is public and current. Its most recent 5-year reviews in 2023 and 2025 reporting that the remedies at 32 of 33 cleanup units are protective, with further action recommended at several. That is a live status report, not history, which points to the mistake almost everyone makes about a place like this. People assume the interesting questions are all in the past. What the Army did to those men decades ago safely closed. But Edgewood never became history. The peninsula is still an active Army installation, still the Army's principal center for chemical and biological defense research. And the munitions in the marshes and the shallows did not go anywhere. Here's the part that even people who know the experiments tend to miss. The chemical weapons themselves, the ones you could account for, were dealt with. Between 2003 and 2006, the Army destroyed the 1,600+ tons of mustard agent stored in those ton containers at Edgewood on site and closed the disposal facility's permit in 2007. That was the resolved part. But that was the inventory, the material the Army knew it had and could point to. What remains is everything the Army cannot fully account for. The unexploded ordnance, some of it chemical, scattered across the ranges, buried in the pits, and lying in the sediment of an estuary that drains into the drinking water and the fisheries of one of the most populated corridors on the East Coast. The Army's own assessments say it plainly. Access must stay restricted because the ground and the water hold munitions that were fired or dumped over many years, and boaters and trespassers who crossed the line could contact them. So what is Aberdeen hiding that nobody talks about? Not one thing, and that is the point. It is not hiding a single secret behind a fence. It is holding, in plain view, a century of decisions that were never really concealed and never really confronted. The chemical weapons program that started it. The 7,000 volunteers whose consent the Army no longer defends. The white phosphorus in the tidal flats. The unexploded rounds in the creeks. All of it documented. All of it public. All of it sitting 20 miles from a major city on the edge of a bay that millions of people love and use and eat from. The secret was never that any of this was hidden. The secret is that it was disclosed, filed, and then quietly left alone, because a fenced peninsula reads as a weapons range and almost nobody looks closer. Come back then to that word. When the Army called those men volunteers, the word was doing a job. It was meant to make a signature stand-in for understanding, to make an offer made inside a chain of command sound like a free and informed choice. And the deepest question this whole place leaves you with is not really about nerve agents or white phosphorus. It is about who gets to decide, decades later, whether that word still holds. The men who signed are mostly gone now. The forms they signed are still on file. And the Army that will not defend those forms is still there on the peninsula, still doing the research, still restricting access to the water, still, in its own careful language, working to protect the public from what it left behind. You do not have to go to Maryland to see it. Open the Department of Defense's page on the Edgewood Arsenal Chemical Agent Exposure Studies and read it to the end. It lists the years, the number of men, the chemicals, in the flattest prose imaginable. Notice that it exists at all. It was not written to alarm anyone, and it was not written to hide anything. It was written to be filed. And that is the whole story of Aberdeen in one document. A grave thing, stated plainly, put on the record, and trusted to sit there unread on the edge of a bay 20 miles from a city where almost nobody ever thinks to ask what the fence is actually for.